Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Ron Jones. We're going to have this breaking news right now. Tonight, the Carter Center confirms that James Earl Carter Jr. has passed away. Jimmy Carter was the 39th President of the United States and a Nobel Prize winner as well. He took his final breath surrounded by family and friends in Plains, Georgia, the town where he was born on October 1st, 1924. Jimmy Carter was a loving husband to Rosalind for 77 years and the father of 4. He led the state of Georgia as governor from 1971 to 1975 and a state senator in the years before that. Then he was elected the 39th President of the United States, serving in the White House from 1977 to 1981. You recall that Rosalind died on November 19, 2023 at 96 years old. Now, in the White House, Carter was able to mediate peace between two longtime enemies in the Middle East, but it's from the Carter Center here in Atlanta where he launched some of his most significant achievements, waging peace, fighting diseases, and building hope. 11 Alive's Cheryl Preheim has a look back at the life of our 39th president.
Although Plains, Georgia has made its mark as the birthplace and home of Jimmy Carter, the boy who grew up to become president actually spent his formative years in a place even smaller than Plains, 2 miles away in an unincorporated and predominantly black community called Archery.
During the dry season, when we were cultivating crops and planting and cultivating and harvesting, we were extremely busy in the field. And Daddy was a very good taskmaster. He taught me the benefits of hard work.
Daddy was Earl Carter, a larger-than-life farmer who successfully ran a country store in Archery and an agricultural warehouse in downtown Plains. Mama was Lillian Carter, a spirited woman who worked as a small-town nurse. When he graduated from Plains High School, Jimmy Carter went to a community college in nearby Americus, then Georgia Tech. But Earl Carter wanted his son to go to the Naval Academy, and 2 years later, Carter received a wartime appointment. It put Jimmy Carter in U.S. Navy submarines and sent him around the world. He would marry Rosalind Smith, a hometown girl who grew up just a few doors away from the Carter family. A few years later, Carter returned home and entered the world of politics. His first victory was a state Senate seat.
I was able to get a 4-year college approved in Americus, our county seat, and that got me reelected without any opposition. And then I decided to run for the U.S. Congress against a Republican incumbent, Bo Calloway, who was from West Point, and he was an antagonist of mine in many ways. He withdrew from the congressional race and left me with the congressional race won. I decided he wanted to run for governor. I decided to run for governor against Calloway, so I ran for governor in '66 and lost.
And against Lester Maddox.
And against Lester Maddox.
Lester Maddox was a fiery segregationist who didn't get enough votes to win the election, but became governor after the legislature stepped in. Carter went back to Plains and plotted to run for governor again. It was a race that shook the state in 1970. This time, he won.
I say to you quite frankly that the time for racial discrimination is over.
Carter's inauguration speech stunned his listeners, but that speech, as well as his 4 years as governor, gave him a reputation as a new kind of Southern politician.
People were looking for someone that was not from Washington.
Jay Hakes, another early key Carter supporter, was impressed immediately with Carter's command of detail on major issues. Hakes believes it was Carter's status as a Washington outsider and his faith-based ethics that resonated with most voters as he was running for president.
We now have a projected winner in the presidential election. NBC News projects James Earl Carter of the state of Georgia elected the next president of the United States.
When Jimmy Carter brought his good intentions into the White House,
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear that
he began with an ambitious agenda. President Carter attacked the energy crisis, fuel shortages, and rising prices. He created the Department of Energy. He told us we all must do our part.
All of us must learn to waste less energy.
This was the president who, in March of 1979, engineered the Middle East Peace Treaty, just 6 months after the preliminary agreements were first reached at Camp David, one of the greatest diplomatic achievements in U.S. history.
Carter's involvement was very, very necessary, and this brought peace between Egypt and Israel that has lasted to this day.
Jimmy passed more legislation than any president except Lyndon Johnson since the World War II. Good legislation. We're making friends in the world.
Most presidents, after they're done with office, they're playing golf, they're on the lecture circuit sometimes, they serve on corporate boards. He made it a mission to continue what he thought was important to the world.
And what was important? First, fighting for justice.
The most enjoyable and exciting, challenging things are when we break down those barriers and reach out to others.
The Carter Center, since 1989, has worked with 38 countries to monitor and ensure fairness in nearly 100 democratic elections. On the other side of the planet, guinea worm disease has affected millions. Carter championed its removal, and in 3 decades, the number of cases dropped to dozens. The only other disease eradicated ever, smallpox. And with every cause, Carter aimed big. In 1976, a humble husband and wife in the humble city of Americus, Georgia, founded a humble nonprofit, Habitat for Humanity. The goal? To build houses for those in need. It remained humble until it courted a former president. His approach to Habitat reflected his outlook overall, affecting the world and never forgetting its roots. It is the strength of a global icon, the strength of a man from Plains, Georgia.
Well, as you can imagine, we are getting reaction from around the world right now. This coming in right now from Governor Brian Kemp, saying that his family are mourning the loss of the great legendary President of our United States, Jimmy Carter. And of course, you can read the entire statement from Governor Brian Kemp right now on X. You know, in recent years, the former president's health has been a concern. In 2015, he revealed that he had melanoma and that the skin cancer had spread to his brain. Now, Carter underwent a new form of cancer treatment, and after just 3 weeks of therapy, there were no signs of cancer on his brain. And at the time, he talked about his own mortality.
I didn't go into an attitude of despair or anger or anything like that. I was just completely at ease. As Rosen would testify, I think if you have any doubts about my veracity, but I've just been very grateful for that part of it. So I'm ready for anything.
In 2017, President Carter was hospitalized for dehydration while on a Habitat for Humanity build in Canada. And then 2 years later, he had a fall in his home in Plains just before that Habitat build. His face was bruised, but he just continued to get right back at work building a Habitat home in Nashville, Tennessee. In 2022, he made 2 appearances of note, both, of course, down in Plains, Georgia, his hometown. One was in August to celebrate Rosalind's 95th birthday. And then in September of 2022, the couple came out for the 25th annual Peanut Festival Parade. The former president and the first lady were driven around Plains in a 1946 Ford Super Deluxe convertible. This is the same model and the same year of the Carter's car at the time when they were married. And then in February of 2023, the Carter Center shared the news that former President Carter would begin receiving hospice care. They shared that the former president would spend his remaining time at home in Plains. In its statement, the Carter Center said that he has had the full support of his family, of course, and medical team. And then in September of 2023, former President Jimmy Carter and First Lady Rosalind Carter made another public appearance that kicked off the first weekend of fall at the Plains Peanuts Festival. The Carters were riding through the parade and waving to the citizens there of Plains. This is video of President Carter at Rosalind's funeral. The former First Lady passed away November 19th, 2023. Her service at the time was at Emory on November 28th of 2023. Her burial was in Plains November 29th of 2023. By the way, folks, from the red clay soil of rural Plains, Georgia, to becoming the most powerful man on the planet, Jimmy Carter never forgot his humble beginnings. 11 Alive's Doug Richards continues our look at the legacy of the late president.
Although Plains, Georgia has made its mark as the birthplace and home of Jimmy Carter, the boy who became president actually spent his formative years in a place even smaller than Plains. 2 miles away, in a predominantly black community called Archery, Jimmy Carter's parents planted their roots in the South Georgia soil.
During the dry season, when we were cultivating crops and planting and cultivating and harvesting, we were extremely busy in the field. And Daddy was a very good taskmaster. He taught me the benefits of hard work.
Daddy was Earl Carter, a larger-than-life farmer who successfully ran a country store in Archery and an agricultural warehouse in downtown Plains.
I think you could call Mr. Earl someone who was a large figure in this community. He was a person who was very generous, personally generous to people who were in need in the community. He was very energetic businessman, and in many ways set an example of leadership that President Carter picked up on in his life.
Mama was Lillian Carter, a spirited woman who worked as a small-town nurse and was known to bend the rules.
Mama paid no attention to the official segregation rules and regulations under which all of us lived. She treated African American people the same way she did white folks. And she could get away with it because she was part of the medical community. Right. Daddy, on the other hand, he was, I would say, like everybody else around Plains, was a segregationist. He believed in strict separation of black and white people, but he treated the black people, with great integrity and honesty. And we had a long line of people always that wanted to work on Daddy's farm because they knew he treated them right.
The lines were long because the Great Depression had set in and shaped the austerity of life in South Georgia. In Atlanta and other southern towns, new waves of racial prejudice tore away at post-Civil War Reconstruction and created new Jim Crow laws. But in Plains and in Archery, things moved a bit slower.
In this very rural, southern farm context, he had experienced a little bit of a reprieve from the racial prejudice and societal expectations that were so common in the 1920s. And he had a bit of a liberty from that.
Young Jimmy Carter was a quick learner. When he wasn't working or hunting or fishing, he was typically reading and expanding his worldview beyond the horizon of his hometown.
So even though he was in what we would consider an isolated community, it wasn't an isolated community. He was given a wonderful education and came out of it with interest in all sorts of things. And I do think that had a great influence on his ability to be governor, president, and creator of the Carter Center.
When he graduated from Plains High School, Jimmy Carter went to a community college in nearby Americus, then Georgia Tech. But Earl Carter wanted his boy to go to the Naval Academy. And 2 years later, South Georgia Congressman Stephen Pace obliged with a wartime appointment. It put Jimmy Carter in U.S. Navy submarines and sent him around the world.
He traveled a great deal during that time. So President Carter's perspective, already progressive, changed even more during his naval career.
While he was in the Navy, Carter married Rosalind Smith, a hometown girl who grew up just a few doors away from the Carter family. Carter whisked her away from Plains to live in Navy towns from New England to Hawaii. But Carter abruptly left the Navy because his father was dying of pancreatic cancer. Jimmy and Rosalind Carter returned to Plains and moved into a public housing apartment in 1953 and started running the Carter family business.
I was lucky enough to come home from the Navy. I was a full-time farmer for 17 years. But I was on the county school board. I was chairman of the county school board. I was a Boy Scout master. I was a deacon in the church. I was in the Lions Club.
For Jimmy Carter, it was a natural entree into the world of politics.
And the statements are rolling in from across the country. This statement from former President Bill Clinton and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, saying in part that Hillary and I mourn the passing of President Jimmy Carter to give thanks for his long, good life guided by his faith. President Carter lived to serve others until the very end. They go on to say, I was always proud to have presented the Medal of Freedom to him and Rosalind in 1999 and to have worked with him in the years after he left the White House. And once again, there's a lot of statements that are coming into the newsroom, and we're going to share them to you as soon as we can. Now, folks, throughout his career, Jimmy Carter was never, ever shy about saying what was on his mind or going against what was considered the popular thing to do in favor of doing what was right. So here's a case in point. It was Governor Carter who proclaimed January 15th Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And against the advice of some of his closest allies, he put up King's portrait in the state capitol. 11 Live show Preheim examines the former president's civil rights record with a man who knew him well.
1963 would prove to be a year of change. While Jimmy Carter was just beginning his political career, another famous Georgian was leading a crusade for civil rights. Dr. King's March on Washington did not go unnoticed by the freshman state senator. In an interview with Brenda Wood in 2013, the former president reflected on the atmosphere in America.
Well, the mood was one of self-satisfaction among dominant white people. I would say that we were unaware of the suffering that we were causing by 100 years of racial segregation, where the Supreme Court, the Congress, the Bar Association, the churches all said it's okay. In fact, that's what God wants and so forth, to have separate but equal, so-called. They were separate but unequal.
Carter didn't know Dr. King, but he was watching and listening.
I have a dream today.
Carter has described Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech as one of the best of all time.
And I think that perhaps the most effective speech in history, maybe with the exception of the Sermon on the Mount, was Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech. It changed the life beneficially, not only for African Americans, but also for white folks. And it sent a signal all over the world that racial discrimination was no longer permissible or a thing to be ignored.
Marching along with Dr. King was Andrew Young, future UN ambassador under President Carter. Carter and Young didn't know each other in 1963. The two politicians would not meet for 7 more years.
I think I first met President Carter at Pascal's restaurant when he was campaigning for governor in 1970. And I was campaigning for Congress. And the first thing I noticed was he went into the kitchen to shake everybody's hands in the kitchen too. And I realized that I hadn't done that I shook hands with everybody in the restaurant, but I forgot the folk in the kitchen. He didn't forget the folk in the kitchen. And so I admired that.
Jimmy Carter won that election, his second attempt at the governor's mansion. Steve Hockman is a longtime Carter associate.
When President Carter gave his inaugural address, he surprised people by starting out by saying, the time for discrimination is over.
At the end of a long campaign, I believe I know our people of this state as well as anyone could. Based on this knowledge of Georgians, North and South, rural and urban, liberal and conservative, I say to you quite frankly that the time for racial discrimination is over.
Not only did Governor Carter's inaugural speech in Atlanta surprise people, but it helped to usher in a new chapter.
And so he made it a goal of his to move past the old history.
Carter quickly became a poster child for the New South. Time magazine put Governor Carter on the cover with the headline, "Dixie Whistles a Different Tune."
Carter had higher ambitions than the governor's mansion on West Paces Ferry. Although he never met Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he became close friends with Martin Luther King Sr. and Coretta Scott King. The King family was an important connection for Carter's campaign and his administration.
This was a challenge for a Southern white governor to show that he was accepted and supported by the African American community. So the King family support and the support of other supporters of Martin Luther King Jr. was very important to him. And during his presidency, he consulted carefully with the Kings and others in the civil rights movement.
Andrew Young had become one of the Carters' high-profile backers. He organized a meeting with Carter and a reluctant black caucus.
They asked him how many black people he had on the staff, and he said, I don't know. So Charlie Rangel said, well, what the hell are we doing here? And then he got up to walk out of the room, and I grabbed him because every other candidate we'd met with had one black staff member, except the most liberal candidate who said he was looking for one. And Carter didn't know how many black people he had. So I went to the door, and Senator Ben Brown was there. And I said, Ben, will you come in and help the governor? How many black staffers do you have in this campaign? He said, right now we just have 27. They couldn't figure it, that he didn't think race. He didn't act race.
As the 39th President of the United States, President Carter also had an integrated cabinet. Andrew Young became the first black ambassador to the United Nations, and Patricia Roberts Harris was appointed the first black female cabinet member as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development.
He had more experience with black people at more levels than most black people. And especially than most white people.
That I will faithfully execute.
When Jimmy Carter took the oath of office in 1977, it was 13 years after the Civil Rights Act, 12 years following the Voting Rights Act, and 9 years after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. While so much of the progress of the civil rights movement had already been made, Ambassador Andrew Young says one of Jimmy Carter's lasting legacies was his impact on race relations.
One of the true civil rights presidents we've had, along with Bill Clinton and Lyndon Johnson, who were Southerners who grew up in the midst of a very complex racial situation and who were determined to deal with it. And I don't know that anybody was more knowledgeable about race, but who also realized that race, peace, economic justice were all intertwined.